Hey everyone, today I want to talk about some useful tips for the abstract typography assignment. First of all, I'm going to show you two different ways of using the type tool. Now the type tool is the T over in your toolbar, and you'll notice that if you hold it down, you've got a lot of different options. To begin with, we're just going to start with the top one. There's two different ways of using this tool. One is to single click the type tool, and if you create a letter, you find that your letter is an object. You can scale your letter, you can stretch it, squish it, etc. I'm going to undo that. If I hold shift while grabbing the corner, I scale it in proportion. Of course, I can copy and paste and duplicate my letter like so. Now each of these letters are different objects. They can rotate individually, and I can select them all and move them as a singular object. So already you can see how the title of the module, Letters Are Shapes, is coming to be in this assignment. Now there's a different way to use the type tool, and that is if you select it and you actually click and drag a text box. This text box is a paragraph box, basically, and that allows us to adjust the size of the box rather than adjusting the letter as an object. So you can see now that as I adjust the size of this box, I'm not really able to adjust the letters as objects, and if I rotate the box, I can adjust the orientation of the paragraph, but not really changing the letter shapes at all. Now within this paragraph box, I can certainly select text and change the font size and the font and anything about the letters themselves, but it's a different way of treating the text. So those are the two ways of using the type tool. One is as an object, and the other is as a paragraph, a text box. Okay, so I'm back, and you can see I've added a little bit to our composition here. I've also taken this shape made up of two individual T's that are a text object and copied it up above. You can see that I'm able to expand it and distort this as a group, and that's because I selected both of the letters and used object group to join them together as one object. Now next, I'm going to show you how to use object expand, and if you select that shape and you press expand, you can see that you want to expand the object and the fill in this case. And what we've done is created a expanded object as if we'd made this shape with the pen tool. So if you remember how we used the pen tool in our last lesson, then this should make sense, and we can select our direct select tool, also indicated by the letter A, and you're able to distort this letter into an entirely different shape, any shape that you want really, using the same tools that you were able to use when you learned how to do the pen tool. So pretty quickly there we've gotten an idea of how we can turn letters into shapes, and since this assignment is using only letters as elements to create an abstract composition, I want you to know what tools you have at your disposal. So that's object expand. Another thing that will be potentially useful to you is to look into the distort and transform effects. And these can get really funky really quickly, so I encourage you to experiment with them, but don't overdo it, basically. And if we take, for example, pucker and bloat, and you preview this, as you adjust the bloat or the pucker, you're basically entirely abstracting the shape of the letter. So we're taking those two T's and we can turn them into something entirely different that's a vector shape of its own. We can rotate it, we can copy it. And we can so let's take this newly created layer that I made, and we're going to object group that as an entire thing. So now I select all of that together. What I'm going to do, I want to show you how to use layers. So if we look down here in our layers window, we make a new layer. I'm going to pull it underneath layer 1, which houses our existing text, and I'm going to use my edit cut to get rid of that layer that I created, the abstractions. Select layer 2 and edit paste onto layer 2. Let's lock layer 1, and I'll be able to adjust my underlying layer. And now what I want to do is decrease the opacity. So I'm looking to make this layer more of a see-through layer. And so while selected, I go up to the opacity bar and I can decrease the opacity of that layer. So I've got, already some layering going on in this composition, and I want to encourage you to use multiple layers of content and multiple layers within Illustrator to experiment with depth when you're creating these abstract compositions. Okay, I want to just show you another way to make those outlines that the expansion that we talked about. I'm just going to use a plain old T here, and another way to do that is type create outlines. So type create outlines and object expand in this context achieve the same goals. So once I've created outlines, I can also use my direct select tool to affect the shape of the letter. Okay, I'm back. So we talked about layers down here in the lower right corner. You can make layers visible and invisible, and you can lock and unlock layers. If you have a layer locked, you won't be able to select anything on that layer. Right now I'm going to lock layer 2, which is our sort of abstract background, and I'm going to grab this shape that I made, and I actually want to turn it into a pattern. So we're going to learn about the pattern tool. Group those objects, and what I'm going to do is go into making a brush. So if I open my brushes window, you can see that I've got a bunch of canned brushes here. But I'm actually going to drag this object that I made into the brushes window, and I'm going to select pattern brush. Okay, it's telling me I need to create outlines. So how do I create outlines? There's two different ways. I can actually use object expand, which we already talked about, or type create outlines. They achieve the same goals. And now that that is an outline, I'm going to drag it into the pattern brush window, and I get this dialog box about making my pattern brush. These boxes would tell you how to treat corners in your pattern. For now, we're not going to worry about that. So we say OK, and I've made a pattern made out of that shape. And you could use this in a multitude of ways, and I'll let you experiment with how. But for now, what I want to show you is basically how to apply a pattern to a path. So let's take, for now, a path like so, and we can apply that brush that we just made to it. We can reduce the size, and you're able to sort of create yet another form of abstract typography. We can, of course, do it in line form, which is much simpler. And of course, you could do this using cut and paste. But the pattern brush is kind of a basic tool that once you know how to use it, you can use it in a lot of different ways. So again, with this, this is an object at this point, so we can expand these objects. We can apply different colors to them. And we can affect their opacity. I want to make yet another layer. Rotate it so I'm getting some of that into there. And I'd like for that layer to be in the middle. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about is making a clipping mask, which is a really important thing to understand. A lot of times when we're working on these abstract type compositions, part of it is bleeding things off of the edge. So you see the edge of my artboard is actually cutting through a lot of my composition, and I've done that on purpose because I actually want the piece to bleed off the edge. So what I'm going to do now is actually make a clipping mask. And there's 3 steps to making a clipping mask. One is to create a rectangle that has no fill and no outline. So I select my rectangle tool, turn my outline and fill to nothing, and I draw a rectangle that's exactly the size of my artboard. Okay? So there I've got a rectangle on top of my artboard that's just a path. It has no outline and no fill. Now what I do is select the things that I want to be clipped. In this case, I'm going to select everything because I really want everything to be clipped. So I do select all, which is Command A. Now, if I go to my object menu, I've got a clipping mask down at the bottom, and I can make the clipping mask. And what that does is uses that top rectangle that I created as a mask, and it blocks out everything else that's outside of my artboard. And by doing that, I've created a clean composition that is pretty interesting, pretty layered, and uses only type elements as patterns in an abstract composition. So if you have any questions about this stuff, you guys should post to the questions forum in the discussion board. And I'm also going to highlight a few other Adobe TV tutorials that would be great for you to check out to learn more about working with typography in Illustrator. This is just scratching the surface. We're going to do a few typography projects. So have fun with it, be creative, do what works for you. The three things that we want to emphasize in our three individual pieces are scale, dominance, and color, which are three concepts that you're also going to be reading about in this week's reading. So have a good week, and we'll talk to you soon.